Welcome, everybody. We're here today with the Japanese American Incarceration on Indigenous lands, and we have a number of esteemed guests with us that you'll be hearing from momentarily. My name is Natasha Varner. I am the Communications and Public Engagement Director for DENSHO, the Japanese American history organization based in Seattle. And I've been working as part of the planning committee for Tadaima, the virtual pilgrimage. And as we were planning out the summer of events that comprise the Tadaima pilgrimage, we wanted to make sure we acknowledged Indigenous lands that Japanese American incarceration sites were held on. And we wanted to do more than just a traditional land acknowledgement. We realized that this was an opportunity to actually have a deeper conversation about these histories. And so we're really honored today to be here with panelists who are working in this history and who are going to share some of their experiences and some of their knowledge today. I'm going to hand the mic over to my dear friend, Hana Maruyama, who's going to be the moderator for this panel. So Hana's a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota in the American Studies program. She's a Yonsei whose family was incarcerated at Gila River, at Heart Mountain, and at Jerome. And she's working on a PhD that explores the intersections of Japanese American and Indigenous history, and specifically how incarceration was used as part of the process of dispossessing Indigenous peoples from their lands, and also the resistance to that and the pushback to those narratives and the attempt to erase that history. So I'll hand the floor over to Hana.
Thank you, Natasha. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Davina Ruth Two-Bears, a Diné or Navajo, originally from Bird Springs, Arizona. As the current Anne Ray Fellow of 2019 and 2020 at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Davina is completing several writing projects based on her dissertation research. In 2019, Davina graduated from Indiana University and received a PhD in anthropology with an emphasis in archaeology and a PhD minor in Native American and Indigenous studies. Her dissertation topic derives from her grandparents' oral history about the old Leupp boarding school, an early 20th century federal Indian boarding school located on the southwestern Navajo reservation. Using decolonizing research methods, including interviews with Navajo elders and a critical analysis of historical records and photographs, Davina investigates the early history of the OLBS from 1909 to 1942, focusing on how Navajo children resisted and survived assimilation within the context of the OLBS. Thank you, Davina. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yat Shit Davina Two-Bears, Yenishiet, Twitchitni, Nishlin, Tachitni, Bashishchin, Tabahi Dashache, Do Twitchitni, Dashanale, City Tot Dant Nasha. I'm Bitterwater and born for red running into the water from northern Arizona. And like Hannah said, I became interested in the old Leupp boarding school because of my grandparents and the stories they told me when I was a young child. And then as I got older, working as a tribal archaeologist, I did some projects out on the site of the old Leupp boarding school. And I didn't realize that this school, the history of this school was really, it hadn't been documented or it hadn't been written down, even though this place is very important to the local Navajos of Leupp and Bird Springs, because there was a school there from 1909 to 1942, and it was a very central governmental center for the Navajo people and educational center in the early 20th century. So there was only 2 schools on the western half of the Navajo reservation, and one was Tuba City, the other was Leupp. And the school closed in 1942 because there was a lot of issues with flooding. It was built on a floodplain of the Little Colorado River, which is located just basically adjacent to the school, and sometimes it flowed over the school. And so That's why they closed it in 1942. But in doing research on the old Leupp boarding school, the Navajo history, that was what was important for me, because that's the history that's really not there. The history that is written about a little bit is the Japanese internment camp, or the Leupp Isolation Center that was located after the school closed in 1942. The War Department had a memorandum of agreement with the Navajo Nation to reutilize the boarding school as a Japanese isolation center in 1943, which it was used for that purpose for about 9 months, from about April 1943 to December 1943. So because of this combined history of the old Leupp boarding school, this history is very unique, but it's really interesting that, not much research has been done of this place. And that's what really drew me. But more so, I wanted to document the Navajo history of the school, but I do also have an interest in the oral history of the Japanese internment camp. And like I said, the Navajo people, this is a very significant place. It's because of its history as an Indian boarding school and also as a Japanese isolation center. I went back to the Navajo tribe last fall to give presentations about the school, and I went to the community of Leupp to talk about my research and how the Navajo kids survived there. But the crowds, or not crowds, the people who attended my presentation very much were also interested in the Japanese history. They wanted me to talk more about that history as well. But since my research mostly focused on the Navajo history, I could just, tell them a little bit about the Japanese internment history. But there is that interest there, though, is my main point, that, there needs to be more research from Navajo perspective of the internment camp. I think when I talked to the elders, they were very saddened that their school was closed, and they believe there is that the connection is that the school closed immediately after, well, not immediately, but the spring early 1942. I haven't figured out the exact date the school was closed, but because of the proximity to the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the elders that I spoke to, they feel that there's a real connection, that they closed the school because of the bombing, and because that there were plans put in motion after that point to put the Japanese people there at Leupp. So they feel that there is a very strong connection, and for the reason that their school was closed, because the Japanese arrived soon thereafter, or about a year following the closure of the school. But in their minds, they see that the school was closed because they needed a place to imprison Japanese people, and they're saddened that their school was closed. The elders, like 3 of them, said to me that they wish that their school didn't close because they wanted to continue their education, because after the Leupp school closed, their parents didn't take them to a different school. They just kept them at home, and they were upset about why, they had to go home, and their school was used as a Japanese internment camp. And they see that the reason why their school was closed was because the government wanted to use their school as a Japanese internment camp. The Navajo people have oral history about the Japanese that were there, but it's really hard to find people to talk to about it, since it happened so long ago. But that is, one of my goals. I do want to do further research on this. Most of what is written is there was about 70 Japanese men that were interred there for the 9 months, and they were the troublemakers from the other 10 Japanese internment camps, and there were no justification for them being put there. There's letters of them that were written by the Japanese men about why they were being incarcerated at Moab, and when are they going to be able to go back to their families. So they were not given any legal rights. There was no explanations for how long they were going to be imprisoned at Moab or at the Leupp Isolation Center. And the reasoning for them being put there is really very different reasons. Starting unions, and also just name calling of the staff that were working at the internment camps. So or even mistakenly being accused of alleged crimes or whatever, or just basically it's like they're standing up for their rights, and they're trying to protect themselves and stand up for their rights, and that's why they were imprisoned. And so the Navajo people were afraid when they heard that the Japanese people or prisoners were going to be on their land. But eventually they came to realize that the men were, had careers, were businessmen before they were imprisoned, and they were, well behaved. There was nothing violent. They were not the people that they were made out, the scary people that they were made to believe that they were. So the Japanese men were very friendly with the Navajos. There was a trading post that was right next to the boarding school, and it was open up until the 1980s. So this trading post is where a lot of the Navajo people would go, and so they would pass by the Japanese internment camp, and the Japanese men would say hello, learn how to say yate, which means hello in Navajo, but they weren't allowed to interact with the Navajo people. They could just look, say hi to them as they went by. But eventually they got a director at the Leupp Isolation Center. His name was Paul Robertson, who was very much sympathetic to the Japanese citizens that were interned illegally at Leupp. And so he worked very hard to get them their freedom from Leupp. And so after 9 months, he was successful at finally getting the men freed from Leupp, the Leupp Isolation Center. And my mother told me that my grandmother felt sorry for the Japanese people there imprisoned at Leupp. A lot of people felt sorry for them, and they just saw that it was unfair that these Japanese American citizens were being held prisoner at the boarding school. And there's many complex layers of ironies in this whole thing. For one, the government came in 1966 and totally bulldozed that whole area. So it's literally like they're trying to erase history, the history of what they did to Native American children, separating them from their families for, several decades. Children were not allowed to go home 9 months out of the year. And then capping that off with the internment of Japanese American citizens there at the school. And then also at the same time, simultaneously, while the United States government was forbidding Navajo children to speak their language, the Navajo language, in school at Leupp and other federal Indian boarding schools, they were recruiting Navajo men into the military service so that they could become Navajo code talkers and fight in the war against the Japanese Empire. That really it's just so upsetting to know that, they were denying our children to speak their own language, while at the same time they were using our language to win the war against the Japanese Empire during World War II, while they were imprisoning Japanese American citizens at the Leupp boarding school. So it's very upsetting to me when I think about it, but there's this history there that definitely needs to be told, especially now when people are demanding to know more about the marginalized people and the quieted histories in this country. So the Leupp Isolation Center is definitely one place where, and the Leupp boarding school is definitely one place that really needs to be further investigated and researched and taught about to educate our country. So that's what I have to say about Leupp Boarding School and the Leupp Isolation Center.
Davina, also I have some documents that I need to share with you about Leupp because, oh my gosh, there were these like extremely terrible letters that got sent to Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior at the time, basically saying that if Japanese Americans went to go teach children on the Navajo reservation, that they would learn Navajo and then send it back to Japan and basically act as spies for Japan in that way, because they took some of the Japanese Americans from the camps and put them in as teachers on the Navajo reservation, I guess. And so,
oh my gosh,
I'm going to share that with you after this call, but
okay.
I was just like amazed when you were talking about that. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Janine Pease is an Apsalalka educator and Native American advocate. She is the founding president of the Little Bighorn College, as well as the past president of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium and director of the American Indian College Fund. She was appointed by President Bill Clinton to the National Advisory Council on Indian Education and the White House Initiative on Tribal Colleges and Universities Advisory Council. She has also served as a trustee for the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. Thank you so much, Dr. Janine Pease, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I'm very, very happy to join this discussion today. The Apsalalka people have a actually creator-given connection to the countryside where the Heart Mountain Center is located. We were originally in the Great Lakes area as a tribe, and due to the eastern pressures, the settlement from the far eastern shores of North America, and the pressures that then moved many native nations to the west, we also ended up moving in a migration from the Great Lakes area to the northern Missouri area. Our tribe, it has a cousin tribe named the Hidatsa tribe. We were in earthen lodges and agricultural people in the northern Missouri area. And at a particular moment in time, probably in the late 1500s, early 1600s, the Apsalalka people went seeking yet the might say promised land. The Apsalalka creator, Akbaradia, sought the people to find through a great migration of perhaps as many as 30 or 40 years, looking for the best place, exactly the right place for the Apsalalka people to live. And through this migration, the Apsalalka people went all the way from Canada down to Southlands, maybe in northern Texas, through this Great Salt Lake area, finally coming to the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains in what's now Wyoming. At that point, in the way in which we know it, the stars fell on a particular blessed night. They fell onto plants, and the plants were seen as tobacco, a sacred plant. And in this way, the Apsalalka identified the blessed place, the Bighorn Mountains. And so from that point on, and our archaeological evidence shows that we were in the area from about 1100 AD. And so we've been in the area a long time. Our area, we call it Crow Country. On the west is from Yellowstone and the Wind River Mountains. On the north to the Musselshell River, which is sort of a main line right through the middle of what is now present-day Montana. On the east to the Black Hills, and on the south, probably the Wyoming line. And it was a large, wonderful area, an area of tremendous plenty. The buffalo there were millions of buffalo, of course, on the Great Plains, and they were in Crow country as well. We were hugely blessed, and we look at our Crow country as certainly creator given. And so I'd just like to establish with you that Heart Mountain is a part of our most western lands in our traditional Absaloka country. I was particularly drawn to Heart Mountain for reasons that in our stories, in our literature, we refer to Heart Mountain as Four Top's father. Four Top's father. And Four Top's father is a mountain where we find especially the wisdom of the energy of nature, the connection the Absaloka have with all of the cosmos, nature. And it happens that over the last 15 years, the Absaloka people have been returning to Four Top's father. And we do call it the migration or the pilgrimage to Four Top's father, and have a retreat several days to talk about and recall the powerful stories of our relationship with the place, but also the defense of the land. There are a number of battles that our tribe engaged in protecting our territory there. And I was very honored to be a part of this pilgrimage, actually just this past summer in July of 2019. The leader of the return to Four Top's father is Grant Bulltail, an elder from our Bapua or Prior district, who has become nationally known as a storyteller. But the child was raised by his grandfather. His grandfather passed in 1947 at the age of 100. And so this grandfather, who lived in the buffalo days throughout his childhood and youth, and then eventually, of course, lived out his adulthood in his life on the Crow Indian Reservation, which is in now South Central Montana. So this returning to Four Top's father is it's just a stone's throw from the Heart Mountain Center. And it's a very important cultural and historic observation. And some 30 families go there every year. And I joined that retreat and that encampment last year to bring to that discussion some of the history that I've been studying, the history of Crow Indian women chiefs and warriors. We have a very strong matriarchal society, and over the many years of our history and protecting our lands, we have a very militaristic society. We have had a number of women who have become warriors and indeed decorated chiefs. And so that was my part of the discussion there. But I wanted to bring to this discussion today a connection to the man who was one of the men who were particularly essential in the design of the internment camps, and that's Dylan Myers. Dylan Myers was situated in the Interior Department throughout the World War II and the establishment and the implementation of these concentration camps. And at the conclusion of the war, he was asked by the Eisenhower and the Truman administration to design a relocation program that would focus on Native Americans. The relocation program was modeled after the internment camps. And the doctor that just presented, Dr. Two Bears, talked about ironies. How ironical or how ironic is it that the man that designed the incarceration internment camps for Japanese Americans would then turn around and design a program for Native Americans. And so I'd like to tell you some about the relocation program. The relocation program went from the 1940s, actually even some of the earliest relocation of Navajo and Ute were in the early 1940s, even before the war was over. The program went all the way to 1978. It was finally stopped. For the idea was based on what's called the surplus population theory, is that Indian country could only hold so many people. It's kind of like how many cattle can be raised on land. So the surplus population theory that Dylan Myers was operating on said that for every reservation, there should only be so many Indians, and that any number beyond that, the formula they used, they had a formula, had to be relocated, had to be taken elsewhere. Now, we're located in our homeland. At the time of World War II, there were only around 4,000 Crow Indians, and this relocation came to our reservation. We were in the time of our World War II veterans returning to our reservation with a tremendous amount of impact. Of course, they had seen the world. They had been through tremendous wars in the South Pacific, but also in Europe. We had 250 men and women, mostly men, but a few women, who were in World War II. And we had only just achieved citizenship in 1924, so we hadn't even been citizens of the United States all that long. We actually had 66 Crow Indians in World War I, and they weren't citizens. They enlisted in the Army. But that's just a bit of background. Because of our militaristic culture, we were, many of our people were anxious to enlist, and they did participate with tremendous war honors. And one of the things that encouraged the U.S. government to establish relocation was that the Native people who were in World War II distinguished themselves. They had a war record of many awards. They showed that they could be patriotic and part of the general citizenry. So the idea was then applying the surplus population theory was to relocate people into industrial America. So on many reservations, there was a specific officer that would go out and visit people, especially those who were 18 to 35 years old, to enlist them in this program. On some reservations, if you opted to go to this program, it wasn't a requirement, but there was a tremendous amount of pressure placed on people. You had to sign papers, you had to go through a health screening, you had to go through a whole series of a survey of questions. And in some reservations, if you signed up, you had to sign a contract that you would never return. In other words, give up your homelands, give up your rights as Native Americans. Essentially, it was individual termination. Now, there was a whole part of this Eisenhower-Truman administration effort to actually terminate the basis on which reservations were made through treaties. And that was another part of the story. But relocation, there were over 100,000 Native Americans from all reservations that were taken into industrial cities. For us here at Crow, 90 families were relocated to places like Cleveland, Chicago, Dallas, Denver, Los Angeles, the Bay Area in California, into Seattle. And so in a small population of some 4,000 people, 90 families were taken and off into the cities. It was quite a harsh experience, although there are some, and I in the study that I've done, I wanted to interview people who were actually on relocation, and it varies. There were people who moved into neighborhoods where they were the only Native person in an all African American neighborhood. I interviewed a family who were in Compton, California, and the father was in construction. He was getting training in residential construction, and he didn't allow his family to ever leave their house except the children to go to school. The wife never actually left to even go to church or shop. And after they were on relocation for a year, they came home and never spoke of being on relocation ever again. It was a very harsh experience to be taken from your language, the Apsaluke language, which everyone spoke in that particular period of time. Others went to Cleveland. There's a family that went to Cleveland that became acquainted with the first African-American mayor of Cleveland and became involved in a whole lot of activism and building of community and so on. So its relocation was something that really changed the nature of the Apsaluke people, because of all those families who went. All but 3 came back, but those 3 stayed and took up their lives and livelihood there. So that's what I wanted to talk with you about. I do know that during the construction of the Heart Mountain Center, there were a number of Crow Indian men who were involved in the construction crews. My own father was in the construction crew, and he said he didn't have any idea what they were building. He was 19 years old, and they were just over there. They'd go over there for a period of days, and then they'd come home. And so he always felt really sad in his later adulthood that he had participated in building that center, but that he didn't realize as a 19-year-old what it was that they were building. So those are the things that I would like to bring to this discussion today, just to make that connection of the land, our indigenous lands, and our Crow Indian country. Well, our last treaty made the southern line at the Montana-Wyoming border. We, as Crow Indian people, do hunt in Wyoming. Even as recently as 2019, a hunting case came before the Supreme Court of the United States, and it was stated there in the decision that our hunting rights are still there. So of course we claim Wyoming as our home and our homelands. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Davina and Janine. Robert Johnson, Akimel Aatam, has worked at the Huhugam Heritage Center since 2003 when it first opened. He was raised on the land and was taught traditional knowledge by his elders about farming, hunting, places on the landscape, especially the use of desert plants, languages, and other cultural traditions. He develops community-based language immersion classes for community members and other lessons to teach both heritage languages of the community, Akimel Aatam and Pipash. These classes also educate students on traditional knowledge of ethnobotany, ornithology, mammalogy, herpetology, geology, and astronomy. He writes monthly articles on language and culture for the community's Gila River Indian News. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Ani Ventura, Robert, Chikwati, Hukanki, and Mustama Kogamara. Wapakogama, Humachkum, Atmos my Atham was my Atham Pimada. So hello, my name is Robert Johnson. I work here at the Hoogan Heritage Center. I teach language and culture to the children, and I teach language and culture to community members. Pleased to meet everyone.
Robert, do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of the Grik and Akimel Aatam on the land and that sort of stuff?
Yes, we've been here since time immemorial, and we have been impacted by many Europeans that passed through this area, the first starting with 1694 with Padre Kino and the subsequent padres that followed him during the Spanish era. And after the Mexico won its independence from Spain, then we had a Mexican era padres and explorers come through. And then during the Mexican era, we had the beaver trappers come down the Gila River, Salt River, Verde River. And after that, we had the war with Mexico. And that's when the Mormon Battalion came through. And then also too, later on, the after the Americans settled the area, they had the American Civil War, and Kearny came through with his army before the Mormon Battalion, but during the Civil War, Army of the West came from California, and they came east, upriver, to fight the Confederates. And one of the battles they fought was at the Tacho Peak. And during that time, with the subsequent interactions with these explorers, that really had a high impact on our economy and in our language, both Akamaha and Pease. And then one of the biggest impacts was 1849 during the California Gold Rush. 60,000 individuals passed through the Gila River on their way to California. But as we learned this language, we learned Spanish first. After the Spanish and the Mexicans left, and then the Americans came, and then we learned English. So during these interactions, we have had a lot of impacts to our land, a lot of impacts to our society. And one of the greatest impacts was the loss of the Gila River water. We just recently got that settled. And then what's the other thing that went on too was the military people coming through. And that we all know from during the war era, Executive Order 9066, it had an impact on our land because they came and built Rivers, Arizona, Canal and Butte, Kansas. And that kind of impacted our landscape because a lot of our agricultural fields were taken up for those two camps.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
For taking up for those two camps.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. Thank you to Davina, Janine, and Robert. And thank you to all of the other folks who have been helping to get this panel together. Those are Natasha Varner, Erin Aoyama, and Koji Lau Ozawa. And as well as the team who has been helping us to meet all of our technological needs and is making sure everything goes smoothly today, Kimiko and Royce. And thank you to everyone who is working on the Tadaima Programming and Densho for hosting this panel. Our final panelist, Ron Moore, is unfortunately unable to join us today. So we're going to kick off the next portion of the discussion with some questions. I'll begin, but as we do so, I'd love if the audience members would submit any questions that you may have to us via the YouTube live chat. And yes, so on to the next question. So I'd love to hear a little bit from each of our panelists. I know that land tends to be very important to Indigenous identities, and I'm sure that's very specific to each of your communities and nations specifically. So I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you about how your lands figure into the formation of your identity. Davina or Janine, do either of you want to go first?
I can go first.
Thank you, Davina.
Yeah, the landscape is extremely important for the Diné people. We have sacred mountains, 4 sacred mountains. Actually, there's 6 sacred mountains, but the 4 major mountains are it defines our traditional landscape, and it's also very important in our philosophy, our teachings, our religion, our ceremonies. We call upon the sacred landscape, the traditional sacred places, especially the sacred 4 sacred mountains, are paramount. And that's one thing I studied with my dissertation. I talked about how the Leupp boarding school, you can see very clearly in the western landscape the Dok'osli, which is the glittering mountain, the sacred Navajo mountain of the west. It's very clear to from the old Leupp boarding school, and this is a source of strength for our people to this day. That those mountains are integral to who we are as Dene. It defines our sacred or our traditional landscape. Again, this is a source of strength, and I talk about this with how students at Leupp boarding school could see the mountain very clearly, and so it was a way for them to identify with who they were as Dene and gave them strength as well. And it was really cool in looking at some of the picture or documents about the Japanese isolation center, the Leupp isolation center. Some paintings were done by an artist, a Japanese artist who is at the Leupp Isolation Center, the old Leupp boarding school, and he painted in the second story of the dormitory, where he said that a lot of the rooms upstairs were empty, and so it allowed him a great view of the Dok'osli, the mountains to the west, and he painted beautiful paintings of that mountain, because it is a beautiful mountain. It's very, the reason why it's called Glittering Mountain is because of the snow that stays on the mountain up, into early summer. And he appreciated our sacred mountain and painted paintings of the mountain. So that's what I'll end with.
Janine, can you go next?
Thank you for the question. I do think that the connection to our land can be especially described as spiritual connection. We have been living on in this Crow country for hundreds of years, and in that course of that time, in the first place, we were brought there by Baradia to realize exactly the right place for our people to live, as I described earlier. But beyond that, we have many places in our land where our people have received visions and directions for our very existence. We, as a people, have defended our boundaries, defended our resources, our families, and our very, very important places. And so we see the ground that we walk on as essentially showing the blood of those who have defended our country on our behalf, of the future generations. As we go around our country, we have water that has given us life, and we have a very rich tradition of the story of things such as the rivers, the mountains, even the springs in certain locations that have instructed us and with which we have relations. We did a study with our elders about 25 years ago and named over 8 places, took our elders to places and did a 360-degree recording of that location, as well as the kind of relation that people from various districts had with those places. Birthplaces, places of the passing of individuals, big battle sites. And so the relationship to the land is really very comprehensive, and one that's well documented in our oral history and literature, but even in the present day through video and the whole telling of the stories and those relationships.
Robert, I'm not sure if you heard the question. Do you want me to say it again for you?
Say again?
Okay. So the question is, how does the land figure into your identity as an Indigenous person?
Yes, the landscape is very sacred to us at Buckamaw. We've lived on the Gila River, Middle Gila River Valley since time immemorial, starting with our ancestors, the Ulugum. And through the years, we've become one with the land. And right now, since those days, we've been farmers. A lot of occupational sites, Groovy sites, Snaketown, a lot on the Phoenix Basin Valley, where they had early irrigation canal systems and cultivation fields, and we still carry on that tradition today.
Thank you so much. So now on to the next question. So you all kind of touched upon this in your talks, but I want to give you the chance to elaborate a little bit further on it. So what is the significance of the sites of Japanese American incarceration that you were specifically thinking about to your communities? And how has that relationship changed over time? How has your access to that site changed over time?
I think the main village that was impacted were the ones in Valaki district, mainly Casablanca, with the closest proximity to the internment camp. At that time, it was a empty desert, and the War Department and the federal government chose the site because it was miles from any closest city, would be Casa Grande and Chandler. And at that time, it was unoccupied, or the land was not used for farming by the tribe. But all the villages were connected, and all the families were connected, and they all lived on agriculture.
Janine, I know that the Apsalaka had a kind of different relationship with the land, or different ability to access that land in 1942 than the Gila River Indian community and the Navajo Nation. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you about that.
Again?
Sorry, that was at Janine, Robert.
Oh.
Hana, if you're calling on, can't hear what the question was. I apologize.
Oh, okay, no worries. I'll say it again. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the significance of the site of Heart Mountain to the Apsalaka, and how the relationship with that was affected by the creation of Japanese American incarceration camps on these lands, and if that relationship, how that relationship has been affected over time through access. Did that come through?
Davina, can you hear what she's saying? Because I cannot. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Why don't we go with Davina first then? And I'm going to write this into the chat. Can you see the chat? Let's try Davina, and then we'll come back and I'll say the question again, and hopefully the internet will have picked up by then.
Oh, same question?
Yeah, I think so. Well, yeah, but for Danae and Leupp.
Yeah. The access to the boarding school site is it's part of the reservation, and it is like I said, it's a very important place to the local community. The community knows of this site. It is a historic archaeological site. I saw in the comments people asking if the buildings are still there, and no, they aren't. They were bulldozed, all of them except for two houses that were occupied by Navajo families. So now there's a couple of families that live adjacent or basically on the site of the old Leupp boarding school, but it is a historic archaeological site. And it is a place that is very important to the local communities because they know it was a boarding school. And then it was also a Japanese isolation center. And there's no historical markers, and it hasn't been mapped as an archaeological site, even though it's you can very much see that there are features on the ground. There's historical artifacts all over the place. Even though the school's not there, it is definitely an archaeological site, but it has not been recorded by the Navajo Nation or anyone else. There has been no archaeological investigation done at this area. And that's something that I'm interested in pursuing with a more experienced historical archaeologist, and also, but with the consent of the Navajo people. There is a very definite interest by the local chapter, which is the local governmental entity called Leupp chapter. They would like to do some kind of public programming or some kind of way to commemorate the history of the old Leupp boarding school, or some kind of maybe historical marker. I want to talk to them more about the ideas that they have, what they want to do there. But you know, it is a place where Navajo people, certainly they live out there right now, so we would have to have the consent of the people that are living there, and of course the Navajo tribe. But it's a significant place, and I think that there are many places on the Navajo reservation that are important to the Navajo people, but it's like that history is silenced because researchers have not, you know, they tend to research what interests them, and a lot of times researchers don't ask the Navajo people what they would like to have researched. But now that Navajos are becoming interested in or obtaining their degrees, and they have interests on the Navajo reservation, whether it's the history or working with the contamination of uranium mines on the reservation, there are Navajo academics and scientists and scholars who are beginning to conduct research on the Navajo reservation, and that's what I would like to do, is research places like the old Leupp boarding school, whose history has been silenced, and to work with my people who have an interest in having some kind of public programming or historical marker or whatever at the site of the old Leupp boarding school.
Thank you, Davina. So I think, Janine, can you hear me now? I think we'll just keep going until she seems to hear me. So I'd love to hear a little bit, and I really appreciate what you're saying about the need to kind of recognize that there are multiple histories on these lands, and that some histories can at times overshadow other histories. And I'd love for Japanese Americans to work with your communities to find ways to make sure that those histories are not getting erased. And I'd love to hear from you about what those kinds of partnerships look like and what roles Japanese Americans should be taking on in that. Davina, I might go to you since you seem to have the best internet connection.
I'm
The sound so garbled. I haven't been able to hear the discussion at all, so I think I may need to just be a listener here. I'm so sorry.
It's okay, Janine. Thank you so much. And if you want to step in at any point, I think you should just say it, okay? Yeah? Okay. Davina, sorry to interrupt. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Well, I had contacted a historical archaeologist from, he's of Japanese descent, and we were thinking of possibly doing some kind of work at the site of the old Leupp boarding school, and we wanted to talk to the Leupp chapter to see what they would be interested in having us do. But he became really busy, and then the pandemic happened, and so our plans kind of got sidetracked. But again, I think that well, one thing that we did do, or we're trying to do, was, we submitted a grant application for funding to do some work at the old Leupp boarding school, but unfortunately we didn't, as far as I know, we didn't get the grant. And so, you know, that's, of course, funding is one thing that's always needed to do any kind of project. And that's where we just kind of got stuck. Was we applied for funding, we didn't get it, and then the pandemic happened, and you know, we're just our you know, further meetings with the local chapter. I haven't gone out there again, even though I want to, because, you know, again, because of the COVID-19 crisis, especially, is hitting the Navajo Nation really hard. So I guess I've often wanted to visit the Amachi Historical Archaeological Field School in the Amachi Japanese internment camp in Colorado. And I've been wanting to participate in that project to see how they are doing that, running that historical archaeological field school. And if, I mean, that would be my dream, is to like have a field school at Leupp where, you know, not only Navajo kids or college students could learn how to do archaeology or oral history, but other non-Navajo or even, you know, Japanese American students could also be there at the field school as well. And so, and I have an interest in like presenting, doing more research on the Japanese internment. And for my dissertation, I interviewed elders, and I would like to interview, but I interviewed them specifically on the Navajo boarding school history and not the Japanese internment history. So I would like to go back to some of the elders I interviewed to talk to them about the Japanese, the Leupp Isolation Center, and interview other elders. The elders that were alive during that time are very elderly right now. They're like in their 90s, late 90s. So, you know, it is very difficult to find people who are alive back then. But I know that there are oral history that has been passed down through the families. So I have these ideas. I'd like, you know, to do more research, do a field school, visit the Amachi project that is happening to get ideas and feedback from them, and you know, possibly establish a historical marker there at the site of the old Leupp boarding school, which the Navajo Nation, I talked to people in the Parks and Recreation Department, and they would like to establish historical markers across the Navajo Nation, and I think one established at the old Leupp boarding school would be really important to have.
Yeah, agreed. Robert, do you want me to repeat the question for you, or you good to go?
Oh, no, I heard that.
Okay, great. Take it.
Okay. Do you want to hear about what we're doing here?
Yeah, so yeah, what you're doing, how Japanese Americans can help you, and specifically Gila River descendants as one. I definitely want to hear more personally about how we can help the Gila River Indian community with the work that you're doing.
Yes, they have done a archaeological dig in 1993, and then they also did a oral history interview with Japanese citizens. The reporter titled "Return to Butte Camp" by Ora Kamer, and she interviewed Japanese American citizens and Hakama Awesome who worked at the camp. That's available for download. And also they did an archaeological dig there too, and those are at our museum at the Leupp Heritage Center, as well as the Japanese American Citizens League. They own some of their personal articles, and they also donated that to the Leupp Heritage Center. And some of those artifacts are on display right now, but due to the COVID, we're closed. And then also we have confinement and ethnicity, 1999, 2000, Chapter 10, Gila River Relocation Center. And then in 2010, we partnered with ASU, Dr. Karen Long and Dr. Milo Vicente Carpio. The project was called Beyond the Barbed Wire Fence, Oral History Project, and these were oral history interviews with Acoma Awesome only that were alive at that time and had knowledge of the camps. And some of them worked at the camp, and some of them saw the camps and had interactions with the Japanese there at Butte and Canal camps. Now, I have given Hana a report. Hopefully she will share with everyone else that we wrote, myself and Louis Barragan, based on the internment exhibit. And we put quite a lot of interviews in there from the 1993 and 2010 oral history interviews. And it has complete maps, everything that one would need to know about from the Gila River. A few photographs, but not too much, because there's a lot already out there on the internet. And there's a lot of pictures, especially in the confinement and ethnicity. And if you look at the DENSO website, you can see a plethora of different pictures from all the different camps throughout America. So for today, we do have an annual cleanup of the War Memorial with the school from the Los Angeles area, and here with the Gila River Indian community, we do an annual cleanup at the War Memorial each spring. And in 1995, there was a war memorial plaque placed at Butte Camp and at Canal Camp. And it lists the layout of the camp and a few of the Japanese citizens who had perished in the armed forces. Just recently, 2009, the Gila River Indian community dedicated a plaque to Masaji, King Mas, and Noshita over the Ira Natural Bee Fawn and Ira Hayes Memorial Park in Sacramento, Arizona. And he played a major role in teaching about what his experiences were at the camp, and also how he served in the Army. And I sent a PowerPoint. I think if you can look at that PowerPoint, you see some pictures of Masaji, pictures of his dedication, and how he was committed to working with Ira Hayes Post 84. It's interesting to note, he tried to join WWII Post in Chandler, Arizona, but they refused him because of his ethnicity. So he came to Ira Hayes Post 84, and they accepted him, and he continued the service to the community and everybody around the nation and the state prior to his passing. So that's one thing that we keep going on with relationships with Japanese Americans. And internees are still allowed to come into the Gila River to visit the camps, but they will have to apply for a right of entry permit prior to their visitation to the camp. And then a ranger will escort them to the site, and they often come out there and visit throughout the year. During the winter, like right now, it's 114 degrees outside my door, and summertime the visitation is very low. But when the weather is nice, a lot of people come over and they go revisit where they grew up or where their parents grew up. So we still maintain a healthy relationship with those former people that were in both camps, Canal and Butte Camp.
Yeah.
We've made some very good friendships.
Yeah. I will say, as a descendant of Gila River who got to visit the camps 2 summers ago when I was at the Huhugam Heritage Center, taking the time to get that permission. It took a little bit longer than another process, but it was so important, and it's so important to respect the Gila River Indian community sovereignty in these cases, and all Indigenous sovereignty. And I think that it actually made the experience way more powerful for me to be there with someone who could point me, who was very intimately connected with the site, and who could point me to exactly where my grandfather's barrack had been, and could show me different, and tell me about the stuff that he knew about the site too. So I really urge any Gila River descendants who want to go visit to apply for permission to do that whenever they're in the area. So taking a question from the audience now, this is from Thomas Kurihara, and it's for Robert. He wants to know, was the land expanded agriculturally during the Gila River camp? And how was that preserved after the close of the camps, if at all?
Oh, yes. Yes. You and the canal camp together, they were the breadbasket of the camps. All the produce there were shipped out and sent to the 10 different camps, as well as feeding the members of both camps. Now, there's an old rail siding that was built specifically for the cattle and the vegetables. It was called Serape, Arizona. It no longer exists. But they intentionally built a railhead there so they could load up the beef and the produce and the eggs and ship them to the 10 different camps. It was right there on Chandler Heights Road. And actually one of the first paved highways, Highway 93, ran from Chandler all the way to Casa Grande, and that provided a safer transportation for supplies and things that were required at both camps. One thing that they were able to do back then is tap into the El Paso natural gas pipeline. So they used natural gas for heating, and they used fuel oil for their heaters. But since that time, we have expanded onto that area that was used as former field developed by the Gila River Farm in 1966. So right now that land is under production. Just as the old baseball camp, there stands a olive grove where we grow olive oil, and the area surrounding the camp is surrounded by citrus groves, tangerines, lemons, grapefruit, orange that grow throughout the year, and we harvest. So definitely the traditional farming that they brought over from with them from California and other places, we have intermingled with them, and they helped us with our farming practices. Now, after the internment was along Baseline Road, there was a lot of Japanese American citizens that had citrus groves, and they had flower shops, which I remember when, as a young boy, you would drive along Baseline Road, and there was all these colorful fields of blossoms of flowers that they grew commercially and sold to the general public, as well as produce, citrus. So definitely there was some benefit on both sides. And I think that it's one thing that we continue to this day is that mutual friendship.
So here's another question from Jenny Forsyth, who asks, I know some thinkers have suggested that for the US government, incarceration was a means to steal lucrative farmland from Japanese American communities when they were forced into this camp. But there's also this wider history of stolen indigenous lands. And how does this World War II incarceration fit into that larger history of American Indian dispossession? Davina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that as time went on, I guess at the first year, when the camps were being put on our community land, our council objected to it because at that time our sovereign nation was not recognized. But then by the time it took the council move to take action, the camps were already up, and it just shows the paternalistic relationship with the federal government, meaning the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the greater government with the Gila River in the community at the time. At the first, there was a lot of resentment, but then a lot of people said, hey, you know what? You're losing $400 a day in rent if you don't sign these lease agreements. So they had no choice. They signed the lease agreement. But on the long run, a lot of the Akama Altam worked at the camp. The wranglers, bus drivers, cattle wranglers, bus drivers, truck drivers, guards, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, and they, over time, made friends with some of the community members, and they knew that it was wrong. They knew it was wrong on both sides. That's why the title of my slide is Justice Denied Twice, once for the Japanese Americans and once for the Gila River community. We're both part of the historical trauma brought in by that anti-Japanese sentiment of Western society at that time. And when the camps closed, people said, we're sorry to see some of you go, because there was some mutual friendships right there. But we know that was wrong on both parts by the federal government. Yeah. We just hope that nothing like that ever happens again.
Davina, I'd love to turn this question over to you.
I think that it's for the boarding school. I think that it's just on the one hand, the establishment of the boarding school for the Navajo students, it was hard for the people to have their children go to federal Indian boarding schools and not be allowed to stay home with their parents, and all these changes that they had, assimilation that they had to endure with, not being able to speak their language. But at least the boarding school was located on the Navajo reservation within close contact of, Navajo families, and again, within the traditional homelands of the Diné people. But having the Japanese interred at the Olu boarding school, it was just another injustice that was done to a minority people in the United States by the U.S. government. Just like Robert said, this is a space that has, multiple layers of injustices and just ill treatment of the people, the racism in this country. The Navajo people and many indigenous peoples, our lands were greatly reduced, and the Japanese similarly suffered from, like you said, their lands, their businesses, everything they owned was taken away from them, and ironically, they were put on indigenous spaces, and it's in multiple injustices performed by the United States government. But for, I don't think the Navajo people really viewed it as occupying or taking away from indigenous people. The politicians thought that they were helping the United States government win the war. And then, like I said, the Navajo people felt sorry for the Japanese that were imprisoned at the Leupp Isolation Center. And they thought that they were friendly people and they were not threatening, and they didn't understand, why they were being imprisoned, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sort of writing my dissertation on a similar topic. So I think what I've noticed over the course of looking at this across sites too, is that often the ways in which American Indian dispossession fit into these sites looks very different. So for Heart Mountain, it started in the 1800s, and it continues through the 1940s with Japanese American incarceration and Japanese American incarcerated labor being used to turn that land into something that can be homesteadable for often white veterans. But then at Leupp or at Gila River, it's this idea that there's going to be a temporary displacement, but also not recognizing the ways in which that also infringed on Native sovereignty. And, as Robert was saying, the Gila River Indian community did not agree to have the camps on their land. It took 6 months of severe pressure from the federal government for them to actually sign any sort of agreement, and they were threatening to withhold money from them the entire time. So I think the way that I see it a little bit now, or I've come to see it, is that, there's this structure of settler colonialism, of American Indian dispossession that just undergirds so much of the nation, of the United States as a nation. And we, as Japanese Americans, it was kind of an easy solution for the federal government to try and use that as a way to further those underlying goals in a really kind of horrifying way. So I think we're supposed to start wrapping things up now, but I would like to just ask both Robert and Davina if there's anything else that you would like to add quickly before we end.
No, I just want to say I just want to say thank you for my participation in this panel, and I look forward to doing more research on this topic of the Leupp Isolation Center from a Navajo perspective.
Yeah, I love that. And Robert?
Yes, thank you for inviting me on the panel. From right here in downtown, center of the Gila River Indian Reservation. It's a very serious topic, and it's very historically relevant to both people and to other societies around the world. One of the oral interviews back then, one of the Arnold Ellison, as a matter of fact, he asked why weren't the Germans treated like this, or the Italians, or other people? Why just the Japanese? And at that time, we were at war with Germany and with Italy at the same time, and there was nothing done to them in the East Coast. They were allowed to come and go as they pleased. The surveillance, but here, this incarceration was totally wrong and unjust. I think that we can take this as a view on history and a view on the humanities as a society.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's people out there who don't want to listen to that. But we, the ones that live through it, those stories need to be told.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm sorry Janine got cut out a little bit early, but hopefully she kind of got to hear the rest of it. Thank you to Davina, Ruth Two Bears, and Robert Johnson for all of your insight today as well. And thank you to everyone who tuned into this conversation. So before we end, I'd like to give a quick shout out for another upcoming discussion on August 9th at 12:30 PDT. Sho Tanaka will interview Paulette Moreno, who is from one of the mixed Alaska Native and Japanese American families that was forcibly removed from Alaska and incarcerated at Puyallup and Minidoka. The event is titled Alaska Native Memories of the Japanese American Incarceration. You can find more on the Facebook event page. So please tune in again on August 9th at 12:30 PDT to kind of continue this discussion. And I think what has really come through for me today is that this needs to just be one iteration of a much larger and ongoing relationship and conversation. So thank you again to everyone who joined us today, and thank you to Robert, Janine, and Davina.